I'm G4, and you're listening to the Beginner's Guide to Model Railroading, the exuberantly opinionated atlas of the basic techniques for the world's greatest hobby. This is BGT Episode 24, Q&A 4, Requiem. In this episode, I'll answer some questions and comments regarding layouts, techniques, and the bold new direction I'm proposing for modeling. Hello everybody, I hope you took many battle trophies during the war on Christmas. Also, Tom Barvelet! That was an amazing episode I'm so proud of. Thank you so much, Tom. Anyway, since I seem to be getting much more feedback these days, possibly as a result of my profanity-laced tirades against modeling, I have accrued quite the backlog of listener comments I should get to. Going forward, I think I'll make Q&As a yearly-ish thing. Maybe if I can keep to it, in part due to holiday breaks, I'll get an interview every December and a Q&A every January. Starting all the way back at Springfield last year, and about as meta as you can get, both Bill Ford and Ron Kleiss, now patrons, reminded me of a comment I have gotten all along. Why was the music so long for the early episodes of BGT? Well, the reason is twofold. Firstly, lost to the long-ago version of the show with Nathan on SoundCloud, we initially intended for each episode to have different outro music that was sufficiently inspiring to get you up and modeling. Probably because both of us were at the time obsessed with steam locomotives and frontier western towns, a lot of our choices ended up being soundtracks to western movies. I think I pretended I was using the songs under a gross misunderstanding of the Creative Commons license or something, but I was a 17-year-old idiot and was probably quite wrong. As time went on, when I restarted BGT as my own show, this habit led to a lack of commitment to any one theme song. Sticking with my inexperience, I kept re-picking the theme music anew for each episode, but this created another problem. My lack of editing expertise meant I didn't know how to edit them as longer or shorter without jarring cuts, clips, or loss of tempo. Hence, for the early episodes, if I chose to use a piece of music, the full unabridged orchestration you'd get. With time and owing to review feedback, I figured out how to edit the music properly and started snipping away the length bit by bit to make the music less long, but those early episodes are, in retrospect, quite rough. Now though, spurred by the restarting as PFP, I have not only acquired theme music which I properly own the rights to, but it is a track which I can accordion to be longer or shorter based on content, as well as make so-called pockets for speech. This is why I plan to someday remake BGT in the future, so that I can send the content to fair trade, sustainably grown theme music accessible on all platforms, irrespective of copyright rules. On YouTube, I got a comment from AJ Kleipass on the Scenery Pedosphere Part 2 episode. They note that cut flowers can be dried and crushed, and fallen tree leaves can be collected and crushed, thus providing copious fine leaf material for free, especially if you gather the cut flowers from your garden, or the neighbor's garden, or the local graveyard. I like the florist wire and hemp rope methods for trunk making. The store-bought tree options tend to be way too small. Thank you, AJ. These are all good insights I thought I'd share. I'll add that, for smaller scales, it's useful to use a blender instead of hand crushing, and I'll echo their comments about model trees typically being too small, especially for evergreens. A similar note, but this time a correction from myself, I have recently been building a small test module for photography and practice from an old ON30 module I built years ago on Long Island. As part of this, I have been trying out my own advice for building roads by using concrete-painted scored styrene. The results are much less satisfactory than I had hoped for or have seen in the hobby press, so I would like to issue a retraction and instead recommend you use rolled road stickers available from a wide variety of scenery manufacturers. You still will probably need a smooth base, which pre-cut styrene could still provide, but the road surface should be something which looks more professional, and that can be achieved for under €20 a meter. Last year, I got an email from Chris asking about N or HO scales. Abridging a bit, they said, Hey there, I love the podcast. Please keep up the great work. I've been on the sidelines for a few years, but have an area set aside in the house that will work well with all the other requirements needed for a young family. It's a 4x8-foot corner in the basement above some existing shelves in our kids' playroom. The layout will be approximately 50 inches high, and I think that it's a great space as it's inside close to the kids and family, rather than a dusty but heated garage. And even though it's small, I don't have a lot of time to dedicate to the hobby right now. My options as I see them are an HO-scale L-shaped shelf point-to-point switching layout, or an N-scale 24 inches deep layout with continuous run and some operations. I was given a few bins of HO stuff from my father-in-law and recently purchased a Kato N-scale set to try out. In the temporary layouts I have assembled, I tend to like doing operations-type moves. However, my kids and partner seem to only want to see trains go round and round. My gut instinct, based on the space, was to buy an N-scale set and do a continuous run, but after using the N-scale products, I think I like the HO-scale switching style a bit more. So the main question is really, do you have any ideas on how to encourage kids with a shelf layout, or should I take the plunge and go into N-scale to get continuous run and switching? Hello, Chris. I'm glad you enjoy. My first thought, mostly tangential, 50 inches is a good layout height for eye-level viewing, but keep a few stools around for the kids to step up and see it too. I would say that there needn't be an either-or between continuous running and operations. Especially on a small layout, it's a common tactic to have the train do multiple laps of the layout between towns to increase the runtime and make it seem like the layout is larger than it is. It's also always fun to set a train running around in a circle, no matter how much of a die-hard operations nut you are. It is possible to do switching in N-scale, and I myself have operated on very, very large operations and switching-oriented N-scale layouts, but of course HO-scale is usually a little bit smoother and switching-friendly. Additionally, many people, especially those whom like switching, but even those whom prefer continuous running, prefer the size, weight, and heft of a larger scale, where you can better feel the mass and momentum of a heavy machine. Ultimately, you're building this layout for you, not someone else. It's a hobby, not a job, and so you should do whatever best motivates you to keep building it. So, from what I'm hearing, HO-scale probably suits you. But that doesn't necessarily preclude you from having features that scintillate your significant other or spawn. My favorite ideas are fold-up layout editions which allow continuous running, but which rest on hinges and temporary legs or hooks that can easily be kicked out of the way and swung down when not in use. In the case of your L-shaped switching layout, perhaps you could find a way to make dog-bone turnback loops on either end, or maybe you could negotiate a thin 6 to 12 centimeter wide shelf that runs around the rest of the layout room to make a circle, accessible from either end to the rest of the layout by swing gates. If you're interested in carpentry and furniture making, people have neatly integrated such features into their home's walls, furnishings, and moldings before. So, in sum, I would say do both. Do what you are interested in for yourself, but also find a creative way to make a loop for your family. It's definitely not impossible, and it will benefit both parties. And coming in right under the wire, I got one last bit of feedback on BGT just this month from Yuval D. Yuval said, "General thanks for a great and unique podcast. I only recently stumbled on one of your BGT podcasts and got hooked. I must say your attitude is definitely different, your humor and cynicism are captivating, but most important, your seemingly vast experience with numerous types of railroad issues, prototypical and scale alike, is amazing." Thank you so much, Yuval. I don't deserve such comments. I still have to go on listening to your podcast, currently on BGT episode 10, and hopefully will not get disappointed, lol. I do not know whether you've done this to the rest of the podcast, but may I suggest that you include links to your referenced subjects in the podcast summary. For instance, you mentioned John Armstrong's notes on track planning. Thanks a lot, and keep on with the good work. Thank you, Yuval. It was really funny getting this email to you just as I was finishing this episode's script, and thank you very, very much for your kind words. I can say that things do change quite a bit as you go on, but if you appreciate my humor, cynicism, and expertise, I hope you won't be disappointed. As to links in the show note, that was not something I did in early episodes, but I do try now to add a few relevant links to the notes section of every episode, when I remember to do so. As for citing everything I mentioned, maybe I'll get to that someday when I redo BGT, but for now, that would be quite a lot of work to go back and fix, so just rely on good old Dr. Google. When I bring up something, I usually try to cite where it's from, who wrote it, or which manufacturer makes it, such that you could hopefully quite easily find for yourself with a quick internet search. One additional thing is that, as a Patreon perk, I'm uploading all the old episode transcripts to the paywalled section of the Patreon blog for people who prefer to read the episodes. I'm looking at you, Linda Eskin. Want to compare the plan with the execution, or want to search for something when they don't exactly remember which episode it came from. If you'd like access to this, it can be yours for as little as $1 a month. Hopefully soon to be €1 a month. Anyway, I hope that helps, Yuval. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you hang in there. Speaking of, moving on to Proto-Future. A ton of people commended me on the Borealis series, too numerous to thank, and I am extremely grateful to all of you for your kind words and listenership and patience. It was quite an adventure, and with any luck, I'll be able to take what I've learned to make more and better adventures in the future. An update on the Borealis, it broke even on its operating costs in a mere 11 days, and passed 100,000 riders in 22 weeks, averaging 5,000 riders a week. It is an unmitigated runaway success, and I hope a blueprint for future state-supported rail expansions. Back when I posted the ill-fated, poorly mixed, and massively overcompressed G4 buffet, patron Andrew LaVergetta commented, magnanimously, "I really like the style of this podcast using a field recorder. I was listening in my car, and there was a point when the Amtrak train was pulling in that I became very aware of the left-to-right motion as the brakes were applied, and the sound drifted from one side of the cabin to the other, and it was awesome. Stereo can be very interesting in a car. This makes me happy for a reason you might not expect. Him describing the movement of the train as left to right means that I wasn't holding the microphone upside down." It was also fun hearing about the layout, since it seems that it's been this thing that hasn't really existed to the average listener of your podcast. That could be for good reason, though. I also like the inclusion of sounds that you used when identifying the things you were interacting with, like the car or the motorcycle. Describing everything is really important for a podcast, especially for such a visual hobby. Thank you so much, Andrew. You are one of my longest-serving patrons behind Pedro Reyes, who I cannot for the life of me figure out how he survived me from the BGT to PFP transition. Thank you also very much, Pedro. Hopefully I'll be able to do some more in the way of sound-rich layout updates in the future, but staring down the barrel of dissertation brain, graduation, and fleeing my native country as a refugee, I don't know how soon I'll be able to oblige, but I'm still making progress, though, on my layout. Slowly. Maybe now that I think about it, I'll try and do some layout updates every May-ish or something. That was when I put out the G4 Buffet episode, right? Yeah, anyway. More on the concept of Proto-Future as a whole, I got a ton of positive feedback, such as from Trains Are Great 365 on YouTube, who observed of my Borealis series that, while train riding videos are quite popular, they'd never encountered podcasts doing such before. I will quickly note that, while I generally agree it is quite rare to find such things as this in podcast form, there is in fact one other that I'm aware of. US Rail Journeys from the Mr. T podcast studio. He's a Brit that every few years comes over and has an absolutely epic American rail journey and records what it's like to ride on them. Although I find it most amusing his mispronunciations of American towns like Utica and St. Louis. One observation I've made since starting PFP, as many have commented on, is the relationship between PFP and the newer zillennial phenomenon of hauntology, alternatively hauntalgia. Hauntology is the antonym of nostalgia, a hatred of the past for having bungled on the delivery of the present. This is not an obsession with flying cars, tricorders, or ocular implants, but rather an irritation at the near misses. This could technically include such things as far afield as the US failing to complete Reconstruction after the Civil War, locking us into a political dynamic of contemptible racism for hundreds of years to follow, but it's more commonly applied to things like the tearing down of old buildings in the 50s and 60s under urban renewal, the massive suburbanization of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the fact that nearly every major US city lost their streetcar network such that we had to start from scratch and build it all over again. Especially, hauntology observes that solutions to modern-day problems are fully tangible and exist elsewhere. The only reason why we don't have good things now is not because good things are impossible or difficult, but because our gerontocratic overlords intentionally chose to have bad things instead, all while near-peer countries decided to have good things in contrast. I will not lie, there is a generational divide at the moment, and I have been noted before for dangerously towing the line to ageism. But I would like to clarify that, at least as far as I'm concerned, simply being old is not disqualifying. It is being conservative, libertarian, or just broadly solipsistic which is at fault. It just so happens that many, though not all, modern-day elderly people fit these qualifications, and there may, in fact, be generational reasons for this. My favorite mock conspiracy theory stems from a recent scientific scientific paper, which found that leaded gasoline cost the United States a cumulative 88 billion IQ points. I can't help but note that today's elderly people were those growing up when leaded gasoline was at its peak, and came of age at a time when such a potent aerosolized neurotoxin would most affect growth and development. Since the US has always been a gerontocracy with a disproportionately aged voting populace, knowing these facts all of a sudden explains so many things. Like the rise in serial killers when boomers were in their adolescence, the rise of car dependency when the boomers were of their primary economic influence, and the rise in political polarization when the boomers became the primary voting demographic. By contrast, generations younger than boomers have bucked political maxim and are becoming more liberal as they age, according to the Financial Times. So let's be clear here. I'm not saying that being old is bad. It happens to all of us someday, and I would be loath to salt my own future. What I am saying is that being car-brained and conservative is bad, and by coincidence, the voting, purchasing, and especially notable here, modeling habits of one particular generation are an impediment to progress and social improvement by being more significantly car-brained and conservative. It just so happens that this particular generation is much older than I. Old people are not the problem. Old and conservative ideas are. This will all be discussed in much greater length in a moment. Very soon after I started PFP, I got an email from a long-lost friend from when I lived in Los Angeles as a tween, Price M., who said, "We haven't spoken in many years, but when my parents showed me your family's Christmas card and said you were doing a podcast, I decided to give it a listen. I really like your mission of critiquing the white supremacist nostalgia culture and practice of model railroading and presenting a more forward-looking alternative. I've sometimes toyed with the idea of building a transit-oriented fantasy layout for my post-war Lionel trains, which only ever get to run on local mid-century nostalgia layouts, and this podcast is inspiring me to consider that more seriously." To Price, I said, "Wow, hi, it's been forever and a half. Glad to know you still remember me, although, to be fair, I'm not exactly forgettable. I'm quite happy you appreciate my manifesto episode, especially tackling the nostalgia fetishizing of conservative boomers. As an editorial reminder, liberal boomers are quite welcome in my coalition. It's just a shame that most boomers are not those boomers. I spent almost 8 months working on the manifesto episode, perfecting the idea, and I am exceptionally happy with the outcome. I hope you keep listening to upcoming episodes. If you like more transit and walkable layout-specific phenomena, I heartily recommend checking out the 3 clinics on the website, as they dive deeper into a more visual medium. The clinics definitely have much more to say on the subject of transit and modeling than the podcast at the moment, so tell me how you like them. However, not all has been positive, as some people have remarkably emotional reactions to hearing true things. At least one troll has been making their presence known on YouTube comments, but in a rare moment of admiration for a tech company, it took me an incredibly long time to figure this out, because apparently YouTube suppresses and hides hateful comments from the creators. That's actually nice of them. In fact, even now, I don't know the true extent of the trolling, but I intend to proceed blissfully unabated. There are some people in this world whom you know, if you rile them up, you are probably doing a good thing. As far as emailed hate mail goes, I did have one very long exchange with a listener in the immediate aftermath of the manifesto last October. We did make up, so labeling this as hate mail is largely facetious, but I do think some points were touched upon which may be enlightening to other listeners. Since the exchange was so lengthy, these emails have been heavily edited for time and clarity. Philip H. said, "Hello G4, I just finished listening to Proto-Future Prologue 1, the manifesto. I almost did not make it through the whole episode, and I may be making a big mistake, wasting even more time on top of the half hour I've already given you, but I'm going to at least draft this and decide whether to send it afterwards. Why did I give you the courtesy of continuing to listen to something which I found so offensive? I have been listening to your Beginners podcast, and I'm up to episode 17. I was sometimes off-put by your strident views, I love the phrasing, thank you Philip H., on things not necessarily connected to model railroading, and by your dismissiveness of anyone who wanted to model in a way you had not chosen to follow. For example, your verbal lashing of the use of something like SnapTrack, e.g. Kato Unitrack, as looking ridiculous and not used by any serious modelers. I do suppose we should all be grateful to have you as the sole arbiter of what a serious modeler is and what that mythical group does or does not do as an entire class without a single exception, but I do digress. Editor's note, perhaps my phrasing was dismissive, but I truly have never seen a large layout built with ClickTrack. Judgment aside, ClickTrack is factually exclusively the domain of beginner hobbyists." Continuing with Philip H. I mean to say that I was sometimes put off, but still found the episodes very informative, and feel some sort of thank you is in order. My thanks to you, which you may or may not appreciate, is to give you my feedback on your manifesto in hopes that it might make your efforts to seek justice a little more effective than they might be otherwise. First, let me be clear about something fundamental. Even though I am in a group you seem to have contempt for, baby boomers from the Midwest, I agree nearly 100% on your politics. I am in favor of very strict gun control. I am in favor of any kind of public investment in clean energy, mass transit, or anything that will help wean us off fossil fuels. I very much wish you and others had access to more modern trains modeling current and ongoing efforts to do something about the climate crisis, even though I myself have zero, zilch, nada, no interest in modeling those myself. I find myself in the nostalgia camp that you so viciously excoriated. Brilliant vocabulary there, Philip H. And I abhor how so many sectors of our society have marginalized and frankly quite horribly abused anyone not in the mainstream. Women, blacks, Latinos, gays, lesbians, transgender people, non-binaries, etc. What I object to and find so offensive is your snide, dismissive behavior towards any fellow human being that does not agree with you on the above. I'll also wager that to enter your seemingly small circle of those considered enlightened, one likely has to agree with you on a few more issues as well. Here's 2 reasons I suggest you drastically change your approach. For one, it's deeply dismissive of the humanity of those with whom you disagree. I don't know your experience, but based on what I've learned from others in my life, I imagine you have been dismissed for any variety of reasons. Your choice of clothes and makeup, your transgender status, your being sexually attracted to different people than some other people are, your autism, etc. People have learned something about you and then decide for themselves who you are as a person based on one thing or a combination of those few things. In short, you have been swept up in a terrible overgeneralization and objectified rather than let your full dignity as a human come to the fore. Why would you think it is any more moral to do the same to others? Why do you get to decide who I am based on my being a baby boomer from the Midwest, near Iowa, which you snorted at in your manifesto, or my desire to model the Kansas City Southern in 1945 to 1950? Not all zillennials are alike, and not all baby boomers are alike either. Secondly, you will be so much less effective in getting the changes you long for. When you are so clearly dismissive, you show you have no interest in listening to who the other is and what they care about. When others figure this out, they are far less interested in listening to you and what you care about. And guess what? Even if you don't do it for the intrinsically moral good of treating other people as worth something simply because they are people, you ought to treat people you disagree with more dignity because you need them. You put the number of queer people at something like 10% of the population, and minorities at something like 30%. You are obviously a very bright individual and can see that 40% doesn't win too many elections. Editor's note, unless there's an electoral college allowing for tyranny of the rural minority. Anyway, you need dinosaurs like me and a bunch of others who are not enlightened zillennials to work with, agitate with, and vote with, or you will never get your mass transit, gun control, or LRV models. To conclude, I want to say I get why you would want to put out a rant or manifesto as you did. It feels so good, you are speaking your mind, proclaiming the truth, at least the one tiny part of the truth given to you. And that's not belittling you. We all, myself included, are only given one tiny part of the truth. That's one of the biggest reasons we should be careful when we judge others, or better yet, avoid it altogether. I do believe that the arc of history bends towards justice, but that arc doesn't pass through the objectification of others out of a sense of our own righteousness. Martin Luther King Jr. took white people to task for the wrongs being committed, but he never belittled their humanity. In fact, he appealed to it. Much work is yet to be done, but I wonder where we'd be now if MLK Jr. had chosen caustic manifestos over love-infused sermons and social action. Thank you for reading to the end, and I thank you generously for hearing me out. I'm not sure what I'll do about your podcast. You have a lot to say, and there's much I can learn from, but I don't know if I want to subject myself to more of your derision. You say that you don't want to cater exclusively to your generation, but your niche may shrink to that if others feel as do I. I guess maybe there's a place for that. Nothing will actually move forward as you discuss things in your echo chamber, but sometimes we just need to be seen by our peers. Happy modeling, and much success to you in your quest for justice. A disappointed but informed past listener? To that, I wrote back, Philip H. Apologies for my tardiness in response, as I spent 5 weeks frantically prepping for my annual PhD thesis committee meeting. I did read through your email, and I thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts. I agree with you on probably more than you would expect, but I think there are still some philosophical differences which lead us to our divergent tactics. Obviously, any generalization will always be inaccurate, but I think the underlying causes for the generalizations could still be agreed upon even by those whom are auspiciously wrapped up in them. For example, take my Iowa scoff. Say that you have a white, cisgendered, heterosexual, elderly male living in Iowa and modeling, say, the CB&Q. Such is not an inherently bad person deserving of derision or elimination. It's what they do, with what they have, where they are, that matters. If said aforementioned Iowan agrees that America is slovenly car dependent, for every registered vehicle, Des Moines has 19 parking spaces, or that there is an overrepresentation of books on prairie fallen flags compared to, say, Amtrak or light rail history, or that there should be more frequent intercity trains, or that there is a shortage of models representing the interests of younger modelers, then the aforementioned Iowan is exempted from my ire. My argument is with people whom cannot see the merit of modern modeling and urbanism trends, whom doesn't just model the transition era because it's what they themselves specifically enjoy, but because they think it is the ideal time period to model, despite there often being evidence to the contrary, at least in some regions. These types of people, while not always, are undeniably more likely to be car-brained, live in unsustainable suburban single-family homes, oppose modern rail transit projects, be obsessed with the railroads of the past to the detriment of the present, and yes, be old, white, and male. And that there has been, in all of model railroading history, only one mass-produced modern rail transit vehicle, Pico's Sprinter, demonstrates that these latter folks have a dominant hold on the hobby. At the end of the day, I am not saying that all old white males are bad, but that many of the stale aspects of current modeling are, if not caused by, significantly associated with old white males. Those old white males who recognize this and work with me to refresh things are thus allies, not part of the problem and not those at whom my tirades target. Secondly, I do brand myself as an enthusiasts podcast, not an activists podcast. I do not profess to share policy recommendations, measured analyses of ongoing projects, or strategies to get favorable political outcomes. There are plenty of other podcasts, websites, and organizations for that, which are all much better and have been around for much longer than have I. I, instead, focus on precisely what I enjoy, and, of course, am irritated by. If people dislike that, it's on them, not me. They can listen to other podcasts. I liken it to a similar situation posed long ago to the Scathing Atheist podcast, one of my favorites. The feedback they addressed was something to the effect of, why can't you give more level-headed arguments trying to point out the illogicality of the existence of a deity instead of being so rude about it? After first rightfully pointing out that they were not the Atheist podcast, but the Scathing Atheist podcast, the hosts proceeded to outline that, in a world filled with the injustices of religion, one where, effectively, the concept of spirituality cannot in any way be avoided on a daily basis, a safe space was needed to blow off steam with like-minded individuals where we could snidely scoff at the feeble-minded apologetics excusing the latest genocide as another mysterious act of God's love, without having to constantly be on our guard about politeness. I do not aim to convince the unconvinceables, but rather to share my thoughts with like-minded individuals. Being more polite and measured in my podcasting requires much greater effort and patience than I am currently capable of or interested in committing, and it is a task already duplicated by many other podcasts. I leave the door open to those whom disagree with what I hope are well-measured, if creatively delivered, reasons for paying attention, and end with, so if you have any love for your trains, you won't drag them down with you by tying them inexorably to a political philosophy which, by all reasonable estimations, is moribund. You can like what you like, but don't make that the definitional archetype of the hobby. Finally, on a more philosophical note, morality, emotionality, and respect are largely constructed concepts without any basis in reality. These things are all virtues, but there is no measurable virtuon particle which you can point to one person or another as being more dense in. The world is a cruel place, and the one and only one thing you are guaranteed to have upon your birth is your own death. Of course, 999.9999 per mil of the time, when someone feels wronged, uncomfortable, violated, or harmed, it is advisable to accommodate those feelings, but that there are frothing-at-the-mouth racist militiamen in the Idaho Panhandle who feel violated and harmed when a Middle Eastern immigrant has the audacity to exist nearby, or a neighbor has a life-saving abortion, proves that just because somebody has an feeling doesn't actually mean that the feeling is correct. Even though, again, feelings almost always deserve respect, that they can swing the other way so easily shows that they are not causative of deserving respect, and we must instead couch our assessments of correctness in some other metric, namely the situation's proximity to measurable, replicable facts and sound evidence-based logic. So, skipping the next dozen or so steps of the logical proof, a statement's truth is unrelated to whether or not a person feels respected or dismissed by it. Similarly, a statement is true whether or not it is made politely or dismissively. If listeners are offended by my tone, it is not my job to educate them remedially on such intricate subjects as reality, or to coddle them into accepting that which is, whether or not they want it to be. I do appreciate your email, and I hope that, with this episode, I've showed you how, with a few slightly different premises, I believe my take to be a defensible one. Overall, excluding your email, feedback has been universally positive, ranging from right on to fuck yeah. If you haven't heard it yet, I think you might exceptionally appreciate my subsequent 2023 interview by Tom Barbalet, which I have linked to in the show notes of both the last episode and this one, as it much more diplomatically posits my position. Anyway, happy modeling. To that, Philip responded, "First off, I hope your annual PhD thesis meeting went well. Next, I have read over your thoughtful email several times and listened to the podcast you linked to, and have to admit your responses were much more level-headed and less spiky than my first email, which I reread with some regret. In your manifesto episode, I feel quite dismissed in my interests and my very being as an old white male, and that colored how I addressed you, and for that I am truly sorry. I do think we agree on much, but I do think we fundamentally see the world in different ways, which will cause us to disagree on a whole lot more. The thing is, agreement isn't always the highest virtue, would you agree? I learn and change very little from someone I agree with. It can be relaxing and enjoyable to hang out with folks who agree and slap each other on the back with our opinions about how right we are, and that has its place too, but there isn't a lot of growth there. That is why I value interchanges like this one. I do hope that you and other enthusiasts get the models you are looking for that reflect the more modern scene and a more sensible way of living where cars are left behind as much as possible and mass transit takes center stage. I hope that someone will take the chance on producing a modern prototype that represents a more forward-thinking response to transportation needs, and I hope that you and a raft of other younger modelers, and old farts that are interested, buy the hell out of them along with any books published on the history of Amtrak, etc. Because if those being frozen out of the hobby because all they see are EMD F7s and books on the history of the Kansas City Southern don't buy the new prototypes and books in sufficient quantities to make it profitable for the companies who produce them, there won't be many more of them to follow. I'm pretty sure that I won't be making up the difference. I want to ride modern decarbonized mass transit. I hunger for more options for getting around, I just don't want to model it. Editor's note, that's one of the purposes of both this podcast and my clinics, to demonstrate that mass transit runs alongside things that people already model. There are, in fact, compelling reasons to model it. But back to Philip H. I'll be modeling one of those American small towns you talked about on the podcast with the Kansas City Southern Belle running through it. Not because I think that was an idyllic time that we need to go back to, as I agree that the 1950s are not a golden age. Hell, we were still publicly lynching black people with impunity in 1950, and the most reasoned response we had was to set up white water fountains and colored water fountains. Nope, no thank you. I choose to model the 1950s because it was the year my parents were married. They are both deceased now, but creating a 1950s scene makes me think of them just starting their life together. My grandfather was a Pullman conductor, and he was working on the road in 1950. Modeling this era makes me think of him, too. I have no emotional connection to modern rail. It's just a way to get from A to B, and while this has a huge value for my daily life on a practical level, that doesn't make me want to model it. Better to get another important to me point here before I hit page 400. I agree that it's not your job, quote, to educate them remedially on such intricate subjects as reality, or to coddle them into accepting that which is, whether or not they want it to be. And if you want to share your thoughts with like-minded people, that is your right, and more power to you. However, if you want to bring about the changes you'd like to see in both the real world of modern transit and in the modeling world, you do have to educate, coddle, cajole, and otherwise entice people to take another step in the direction you are leading. You are right that I resonated more with your tone in your guest appearance on the podcast. I think you did some solid educating and coddling on your initial interview on Model Rail Radio without giving up who you are and what you believe. That might get some of us old white guys thinking about leaving our Ford F-150s at home and walking to the grocery store. Our discussions then went on to a sidebar about atheism, which, though tangential, may still be informative. Continuing with Philip H., rant on. I have no problem with atheists. The best man at my wedding was one. I don't, however, respect the tendency of many atheists to point to some perversion of religion that I don't adhere to, and them concluding, see, it's all crock. I'm not a biblical literist, how could I be? Unfortunately, Philip H., some people still are, and they act in the name of the same God which deists believe in. Anyway, there are two creation stories in the Bible, and they disagree on the details. Which is literally true? Neither, not the point. They are both describing the same theology. God is creator. I don't believe God gave the person a heart attack to teach them patience. That's a horrible, sadistic God whom I've never met. The Crusades, and many more recent examples, were just people doing what heinous things they wanted and blaming it on God. God didn't lead those crusades, and pointing to how the church was complicit, though completely true, doesn't begin to counter the claims of religion that God is a loving creator and who wants the best for all of us. Rant off, anyway. Again, I know this is a lot, I just felt I owed some kind of more respectful response given my earlier snarkier email. Heck, this might be interesting to conclude with. I went back and re-downloaded the final episode of your podcast I have yet to listen to, and the manifesto. Not sure if I'll have the strength to do so, but I may re-listen to that particular episode as well. I'm sure I could learn something. Peace to you, and happy modeling, Philip. And to that, I finally replied, Philip H., it seems 5 to 6 weeks is about my response time at this point. My committee meeting did go well. If I'm lucky, I might be cleared to graduate by next December, so I'll be feverishly working towards that. Retrospectively, I was not lucky. And you don't need to worry about the spikiness of the email. I obviously set out on this journey with the intent to ruffle some feathers, so I was joyously sharing with all my friends I got my first hate mail. That we agree on much makes you not the problem in the hobby I was addressing, so we're good on that. There are many more crotchety old modelers than yourself whom I think need to be dealt with first. While in principle I agree it is wise to seek out different perspectives and continually challenge your beliefs, I am, at heart, a scientist, and believe that there is only one world which remains when all the humans and their perspectives are deleted from it. You're right, agreement isn't a virtue, and agreeing with an anti-abortion Idaho militiaman is at best a tacit endorsement of their position. But I view it as my job as a scientist, and our job as denizens of this world, to come to a common understanding, not from the perspective of agreeing to disagree, or that different people have different perspectives, but that all perspectives are instead a part of a common universe which behaves in one measurable, recordable, explainable way. What I appreciate about your second email, and what irks me so much about some other modelers, is the overt dismissiveness of new ideas, the automatic and reflexive assumption that car good and migrants bad, and so on, despite abundant scientific evidence to the contrary. When it comes to equity, social mobility, efficient use of tax dollars, climate sustainability, and the creation of thriving, livable economies, the facts point to one inescapable conclusion. Passenger trains are good, modern passenger trains are better, and building even more modern passenger trains is best. But when it comes to both the built environment which I inhabit prepared for me by my forefathers, as well as the majority dynamic practiced by the current modeling ecosystem, me and my current generation have been boxed out of partaking in this logical, factual, and enjoyable technology, both as a hobby and as a lifestyle. As I say in one of my presentations while gesturing to a modern passenger train, if I was born in the Far East or Europe, I get this, but because I was born here, I don't. While it's obviously a scintilla more important to deal with one of those two problems if we're to address the impending climate apocalypse and ecosystem collapse, the scope of the problem is a modicum larger than that which I believe I'm capable of tackling all by myself. And, at the end of the day, I like to pretend that this is a model railroading podcast, so I'm ultimately reverting back to the time-honored reason why I bet most of us have gotten into the hobby to begin with, as a way to think about much larger and intractable systems in a smaller and more tractable world which I am capable of building and influencing single-handedly. Maybe the publishing of my opinions and journey can help to nudge the conversation forward in some way, inspiring others to take their own next steps, as everything in my life, from Alan Fisher to Bachmann Siemens Chargers to Cesar Vergara to Amtrak itself to even the concept of bicycling, have influenced me to take mine. I do address the concept of modeling the transition era with a little bit more nuance in my presentations, particularly part 3, specifically saying, I'm not here to cancel the transition era, and not everyone has to model the present or, God's forbid, the near future. The take that I come to and briefly touch upon is that, if you decide to model the 50s, rather than using it as a means to return to an idealized past, you should do justice to all those who lived at the time. If you can, find people or oral histories from diverse communities of the era, especially if they lived along the prototype, and see what kind of ways they lived their lives and how they resisted systematic injustice, just as you would research any other aspect of the prototype. Don't, as with some modelers, idealize the water fountain segregation and depict the system as perfectly peaceful and consensual. Though I doubt you're one of the modelers who'd have issue with this. You seem to be more on my side of the matter. As to constantly politely educating the Ford F-150 drivers out of their cars and into transit, you're right that the best convincing is likely done nicely, but my safe space point still applies. I cannot always, 100% of the time, be on my best behavior in a world built to kill me. Admittedly less so than others of different racial or socioeconomic backgrounds, but it's undeniable that I'm intentionally spiking my likelihood of homicide by infrastructure every time I choose to bicycle along the road to and from work or an errand. Living in an environment as this makes it such that I must, by nature of being human let off steam. We saw how my motivation suffered when I tried, however unsuccessfully, to make a purely instructional, educate the masses project in the form of BGT. At best, I could do 3 episodes a year, more often 2, sometimes 1. Now, though, that I'm taking this in a much more private direction of calling things how I see it and being honest along the way, I can divert the energy I previously expended on being polite into production, and voila, I'm monthly. I can still do the thrice-yearly polite outreach in other venues, which, now that I think about it, has taken the form of my 3 presentations on modern transit and intercity passenger rail, but this doesn't actually even consider the concept of being honest and straightforward. Having just gotten back from Springfield, at the time of writing the email, I was approached by tons of people, many of whom I didn't know at all, and I got almost universal praise, specifically for my honesty. Whether or not most people agree with me, just by throwing away all pretenses and being myself, it seems to be landing, even through the hailstorm of profanity. By hook or by crook, I've tapped into something, and I have reason to believe the way I'm doing it is the way to go. And my response to your rant. I'm also glad that you agree Old Testament God was a sadist. It's surprising how few theists have read their own book. But in general, while it's not impossible for there to be an all-powerful God or life force or something, there is insufficient evidence to indicate that there is one either. There's no physical particle that won't move or have mass unless it's loved enough by a creator. There's no fundamental constant which says life must have meaning, which comes from being kind or being rewarded in an afterlife. And our best simulations of human brains and neural pathways result in computers pausing before answers and having errors and otherwise fully human personality quirks. So it's diminishingly likely that there's any sort of measurable soul, and more likely that we are ourselves computers, just ones built one bush rustle and brain hemorrhage at a time. If there is an all-knowing or all-loving God, it would have behooved them to put in their holy book, oh yeah, and by the way, here are the instructions for making an iPhone or a vaccine. In the absence of that, my stance can be boiled down to 3 logical maxims. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence, and faith is believing in something when common sense tells you not to. Keep the snark coming, and happy listening. G4. Editorially, I'll make one final note. I can understand the need to have an emotional connection to your modeling subject, and really only that can pull you through the inevitable and many setbacks of model railroading. However, I too have an emotional connection with my own modeling subject. Hope. In a world where political polarization between centrist idiots and fascist dinglings is the norm, I can build a small corner of the universe as I see fit, correctly and progressively, making a world in the image of what I hope it may someday be, and what I tirelessly advocate for it to someday become. With that, we leave Philip H. and close on a much more recent feedback from patron Bill Ford on PFP Episode 6, It's Up to Us Now. Bill observed, I'm finally listening to Proto 6. I'm not going to lie, I've been in a funk since the 5th of November, and I'm really enjoying the podcast. I've recently started to take the T to work and couldn't be happier, and I am seriously thinking about getting involved in my town's government because, God's damned, what a great podcast, really good stuff, and very thought-provoking. Thank you so much, Bill. I am honored that I can so convincingly swindle you of your hard-earned money. In all truth, writing that episode was how I got myself out of the same funk. Having this podcast as an outlet for my creative and political proclivities is honestly healthy, and I'm glad I could both use it to process my own thoughts and inspire others to do the same. To those who missed the model railroading side of things, we will get there sometime again, between now and the heat death of the universe. But until then, I'm having fun, and really that's the only thing that matters at the end of the day, right? Fight on, American citizens, fight on. This has been BGT Episode 24, Q&A for Requiem. I hope that with this episode I have shared some insightful and poignant listener feedback. I would like to thank my extremely generous and patient patrons Pedro Reyes, Andrew Lavergetta, Ron Kleiss, Bill Ford, Linda Eskin, and Roger Coleman. If you want to join our currently dead Facebook community, you can, but I gave up social media over the pandemic because Meta is pure evil. Instead, if you have a question or comment, would like to make a donation, or would like to learn more, please visit the show's website at www.bgtmrring.org. That's Bravo Golf Tango, Michael Romeo Romeo, Indigo November Golf, Oscar Romeo Golf. If you like the show, please give me a good review on iTunes and subscribe to the podcast feed. If you really like the show, please consider becoming a patron, as it helps me defer the cost of equipment and website hosting. If you did not like the show, do not say anything and contemplate the thought crime that you have committed. This podcast was written, recorded, and produced on the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, Duwamish, Squamish, and Muckleshoot tribes. I would like to thank them for their historical stewardship of central Pennsylvania and western Washington. And now, as a reward for listening through my closing spiel, your modeler's vocabulary word for this episode is consisting, running multiple locomotives together in sync, achievable with most modern DCC systems by recruiting multiple DCC addresses in a multiple unit function, alternatively, the composition of a train outside of the locomotives. Thank you very much for listening, and happy modeling.